Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar reporting on efforts to retain and recruit school leaders. I'm Denise Supervisor. I'm an independent journalist, and I'm a former assistant editor at Education Week, where I focused on principals and school leadership. Before we start today, just wanted to get some housekeeping things out of the way. If you have a question for our speakers, please drop them in the Q&A with your name and affiliation. You may ask your question at any time, and we will get to them during the audience Q&A section at the end. EWA will also be asking for your feedback about this webinar. Please complete the evaluation survey. Your feedback is really important, and it helps EWA to improve content in the future. So thank you so much again for joining us. So we've been hearing about the big quit in other industries for the last 3 years of the pandemic. And in surveys, including one from the National Association of Secondary School Principals, school leaders had indicated that working conditions might lead them to quit in high numbers. Nearly 40%, for example, said last summer that they plan to leave within 3 years, and about 14% said they had intended to do so in about a year. But despite the long hours and culture wars and pandemic-era challenges, principals do not seem to be leaving the profession in droves, according to the latest federal data. Still, when you look at it, if you look at turnover in the school level and attrition in the profession overall, 17% annual turnover is a pretty high turnover, and it's cause for concern. The percentage of principals leaving the profession is higher than it was 5 years ago. And turnover is especially pronounced in schools serving students from low-income backgrounds and among experienced principals. So we have 3 experts here with us today to help us make sense of these national numbers, to understand the important role that principals are playing in schools, and to discuss how states and districts can support school leaders and increase the percentage of principals from diverse backgrounds. We're joined by Ed Fuller. He is a professor of education at Penn State. Dr. Fuller has studied principals and working conditions and attrition during the pandemic, and he's paid particular attention to Pennsylvania. So he'll talk to us about the state and national context for these numbers. We have Dr. Constance Lindsay, She's an assistant professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and she is a co-author of one of the most important pieces of work on principals in the last couple of years. It's how principals affect students in schools, and it's really a deep dive into the data and research on how important principals are to schools. And we also have Ernesto Garza. He is an assistant principal at Noble Academy in Chicago. This is his 11th year in education and his 2nd as assistant principal at Noble. So again, thank you so much, and we are looking forward to this. So I wanted to start with Ed. Can you help contextualize the NCS data for us? What are we seeing on a national level, and how does it compare to the pre-pandemic levels of turnover and attrition?
Yeah, we've, with the available national data, it appears that and unfortunately we don't usually get it annually, but it looks like it has increased in recent years relative to, before the pandemic. And in the states where we've seen data, that's also true. That's also true at individual state levels. So, for example, in this slide, Pennsylvania, we saw attrition kind of, slowly decline over time until the pandemic, and then people didn't leave during the first year after the pandemic. But then we saw an uptick in attrition, and then a real big increase in Pennsylvania for this last year. And the slide on the right has 3 states, and the patterns are similar. They're not exactly the same. Like Texas experienced a larger increase in attrition than the other states, but all of them show the same type of pattern, where kind of a general trend down, then a steep decline during COVID, and then a pretty steep increase afterwards. And as you said, one of the things I wanted to mention is, so that's just attrition. So turnover is really the issue, and turnover is a person who left the school for any reason, right? Because, as I'm sure Dr. Lindsay will talk about, principals are really important, and when they leave, that has a negative effect on students in the school. So really, we want to look at turnover. And so this slide shows that most of the turnover is attrition, which is in blue, and then in red, you have mobility. So that's a person moving from one principal job to another principal job in a different school. But together, it's a substantial percentage of people. And this only goes through 2021. By 2023, it's probably back up to 20%. And 20% is typical of what we found in Texas, and then some other states have found a 20% turnover rate is not unusual. So think about the fact that 1 out of every 5 principals leaves their job every year. If that was the case with teachers, I think there'd be some blue ribbon panels and, you know, a crisis committee looking at turnover rates. But because it's principals and not teachers, it doesn't seem to garner the same type of attention of policymakers. And then on the last slide, as Denise has stated, attrition is not, and turnover is not distributed equally across schools. So we know schools with lots of kids of color, schools with lots of kids living in poverty, and then charter schools all tend to have much higher attrition rates and turnover rates than other schools. And that's really important for the student characteristics, because especially after the pandemic, those are the very students who need a stable cadre of educators. They need a principal who stays there and knows them. They need teachers who stay there and know them if we're going to accelerate their instruction. But the data that I've seen and I've looked at shows that that's still not the case. It's always been that those schools lose their principals more often, and that's probably the gaps probably just increased since the end of the pandemic.
Thank you so much for starting us off. And so I wanted to switch just a little bit to Dr. Lindsay to talk about something Ed just mentioned about the importance of diversity and who's affected by the turnover. So Dr. Lindsay, can you explain to us the importance of principal diversity, both in the short term and long-term outcomes for students of color? And how does a strong and equity-centered principal pipeline support student success and help close achievement gaps?
Sure. So thanks so much for having me. I'm going to bring up a few stylized facts from the report that you mentioned in the introduction, which I think are super helpful as we're thinking about this topic, and also are a nice sort of add-on to some of the data that Dr. Fuller showed. So if you guys aren't familiar, in 2021, the Wallace Foundation published a report, a principal synthesis of research from the past 20 years. And in that report, we also looked at things like what the demographics of the principal workforce looks like. And then we also thought a little bit about what it means for principals to have an equity lens. But I just wanted to sort of underscore the fact that principals are extremely important when it comes to student learning. And we basically analyzed some high quality studies and found that if you replace an above average principal with a below average principal, it actually translates to 3 additional months of student learning on average for students. But there's some important sort of stylized facts with how the demographics of the principal workforce has changed over time. So one, over the past 20 years, it's become more female. And this was reflected in Dr. Fuller's data as well. But it's really important to note that experience has fallen for principals, especially in high needs schools. So those are the schools where 75% or above of the students are slated to receive free and reduced price lunch. And experience has fallen both sort of overall with the principals and then also their tenure at the building. So they're less familiar with the schools that they are leading. And then we have these very large representation gaps in race and ethnicity between the principals and the students that they're serving. And this is especially pronounced for Hispanic and Latinx students. But besides sort of those, just the representation piece, all principals need an equity lens. And so you can sort of think about the direct and indirect impacts that a principal who sort of has equity on the mind can impact students. So direct things are, an example would be equity in how discipline is given out and needed. And we know there are huge sort of discipline gaps by race. More indirect, but extremely important actions by principals who sort of who have this equity lens are engaging in culturally responsive leadership practices involving families of, all races, ethnicities in the schools, and also hiring teachers of color who we know from the research can have outsized impacts on students of color. And we also know from the research that principals of color can impact student achievement, and they can increase the retention of teachers of color. So these sort of facts, these things that we sort of glean from the data and the research are really increasing in salience as both we're sort of grappling with this issue of turnover and the public school student body becomes more and more diverse. So it's really important for districts and ed prep programs, those who are interested both in principal training, recruitment, so all interested in principal training and recruitment, really focus on both diversity within the principalship, but also training principals to have that equity lens as they go about their work. Thanks.
No, thank you so much. And we're absolutely lucky to have Ernesto here today with us to talk about what it's like to be a person of color in education and want to aspire to school leadership. So I'm going to throw it over to Ernesto to follow up on your point as to why he wanted to become a principal and how his background as a Hispanic American kind of informs his thinking as a school leader. Ernesto?
Thanks. Yeah, I early on, I remember seeing just the different experiences that different, particularly males in my family, had in education, especially in high school. And just for whatever reason, the way I'm wired or whatever the experience I had is I found high school and school to be like a really safe place for me and a place where I could excel and I felt seen. And that wasn't the same for a lot of people in my family. And in turn, they went different routes, including following things like trades instead of college in their post-secondary life. And so in high school, I was sure that I wanted to teach. I was sure that I wanted to be a part of schools that made kids feel successful. And so I applied for something called the Golden Apple Scholarship Program here in Illinois, which recruits high school students for a college scholarship to teach for 5 years in Illinois' highest needs areas across the state. And then that kind of started my journey. And then I entered into charter schools, and that's kind of where I've spent my time the past 11 years, working in Chicago, particularly for me, Chicago's highest needs areas and neighborhoods. And most recently, pursuing school leadership, because I've seen, like Constance referenced, I've seen the impact that a school leader can have on students and how that increased scope matters, whether it was for instructional coaching or being an AP or working towards being a principal. That's something I was just taking notes as she was speaking, and I have so many experiences that kind of align anecdotally to some of the parts that she was sharing there, especially around one of her last points, having leaders of color hire and retain teachers of color. This year, our school leader is a first-year school leader. She's a Black female, and the amount of Black staff members that we've now added to our staff is massive. And it's a shift in culture, and so I just found that to be really interesting as a point there that she ended up.
Ernesto, you were sharing the story with me about the parent who came in and realized that the principal was a Black woman. Do you want to share that with everyone?
Yeah, that happened 2 weeks ago at our return to school orientation, we had a mom come into the school, and part of our experience is meeting the principal and the assistant principals. And so as we sat in the room, when the mom met our principal, Miss Pinkston, she was just like kind of taken aback and got emotional. She started crying. She was so excited to see a Black woman in the school leader role. And she just said like that, I knew this was the right place. And it just had an immediate impact on that mom, on the student. You could see just like something shift in just the level of comfort and the decision she made to send her daughter to the school. It was awesome.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate it. And thanks everyone for the introductions. We are going to try to balance a couple of things. We're going to look at the data from NCS. We're going to look at some statewide data from Pennsylvania that it has. And then Nestor throughout is going to talk about like real life, what does this look like in a school building and how do you prepare principals to work in these environments, particularly with the challenges that we're facing right now. So we'll go back to the data right now. And the first couple of questions would be for Ed and Constance. And it's really geared towards helping reporters kind of make sense of the numbers. So to the both of you, why should reporters keep their individual state principal turnover data in perspective, even as they are looking at national averages?
I'll take that one. And because I've done some analyses in different states and know people who've done analyses in some other states, the attrition rate can really vary by state. So the national data is just the average across all of our states and jurisdictions, but your own state could be radically different from that average. And so as we saw in the graph, Pennsylvania and Nebraska had very, very similar attrition rates, while Texas had a pretty substantially greater attrition rate. So it can be quite different. And even within your own state, it can vary tremendously by geographic area and type of school and the characteristics of the students in those schools. So it's really important to dig down into some more of the details and see who's where the attrition is and who might be being harmed by that attrition.
Yeah, and I'll just add there that in a lot of states, there's a really important divide that kind of gets ignored, which is sort of this rural-urban divide, and the dynamics of hiring and retention for all educators are just radically different. So, for example, in North Carolina, we have many rural districts. I think we're like second to Texas in either the number or percentage of students who are attending schools in rural areas, but in terms of the media attention, it goes to sort of the urban areas, which makes sense, right? But you might imagine that the rural schools really have a lot of challenges with regard to recruiting and retaining educators.
I was
Come on.
sorry, Denise. I just wanted to jump in and add to that. Part of my mentorship program through the Illinois Principals Association has me paired with someone who's from a more rural area. And, one of the conundrums we connect on is ESL hiring and multilingual language certified teachers. And that hiring gap has been something we've talked about, especially in a more rural area, because the population of teachers has been so challenging. And so to find teachers that are in the area and that certification. And so that's something that continues to be brought to my attention through this mentorship program, the differences in challenges, but like how a lot of it gets to some of those subgroups that we might really be underserving, particularly students with language needs or IEPs or 504s.
It's good that you talk about kind of like what this looks like within the states. How do reporters then get their hands on their state data? And you and I have talked about like just how difficult it is for you as a researcher to get these numbers. What advice do you have for reporters to dig deeper into this?
Move to a state with data? No, there's if I was a reporter, and what I do as a researcher is I first go to their state education website to see if they have data about this on their website. So you have to be a little persistent and do some searches and click around. And sometimes you can find data. I found data on probably about, at least on the characteristics of principals, which is what I was looking at. About 15 states had that. It took a little while to find. It's really much more difficult to find attrition data. So what you'll have to most likely have to do is email their communications person and ask for that data. They may or may not have it. They probably do have the data. It's very likely they have never analyzed the data in this way. And one of the things I told you, Denisa, is if a reporter finds out that a state has data, they are more than I'm more than happy to get an email from them, and they can say, hey, this state's got data. Could you take a look at it? I mean, I can try to get it and then analyze it and then send it back to that reporter. I'm always looking for more data, but most likely you're going to have to email and ask them for it.
Okay, right. So let's go back and let's look at the numbers again, right? Let's dive a little bit deeper. We talked about the 11% of principals who left the job itself, and then there's the other 6% that's leaving their building. So when you add all of that up, it's around 17, right? What's the cumulative effect of a school leader leaving their building, regardless of where they're going, whether it's another school, central office, or leaving the profession altogether?
Ernesto and I were talking before this, and it turns out that another way to look at this data is that the average tenure of a principal at a high school is about 4 years. So oftentimes a principal won't see their freshman class graduate. Across all schools, it's 5 years. The tenure at the elementary school is the longest, and then it's in between at middle schools, and it's shortest at the high school level. But that's a lot of leader turnover. And we know, as Dr. Lindsay talked about, leader turnover has negative impacts on schools. And that's true of every organization. It's not just schooling. Leadership turnover often has a negative effect on the organization. So that's a lot of churn. If you're a parent, then you have to build a new relationship with that principal. Again, as Dr. Lindsay said, then a lot of teachers tend to leave when a principal leaves. So now you're building new relationships with teachers. Children have to build new relationships with a teacher and principal. So it makes it really, really difficult. And again, to think that, almost 1 in 20 principals leave their school every year. I would not be surprised if each of you in the different states find something along those lines, a little bit less or a little bit more, depending on your state. But roughly 1 in 5 of the principals are leaving every year. That's a really, really tremendously high turnover rate.
And to all of you, including Dr. Lindsay, what questions should reporters be asking and thinking about as they're looking at both of these numbers, both the overall attrition, people leaving the profession, and the number for principals leaving, again, regardless of whether they're going to another school or the central office?
Yeah, one place I might start is sort of asking at the state and district level, what's being done to recruit and prepare leaders, particularly sort of in this post-COVID world where, we have, a lot, we have these rates of turnover. And then we also have all this research on, diversity and equity, and in theory, these stated goals around pursuing those things. So I would ask questions about how principals are being developed. Where do they come from? So for example, in North Carolina, one of the things that happens is we have these principal fellows programs, and it's a competitive process, and they get, sort of, I don't know if doled out is the right word, but they get awarded to different universities, different entities to prepare principals. And it's a huge investment. And so I would encourage reporters, for example, to ask questions about what that investment looks like. where do those teachers end up? Are they more likely to stay around? Who are they? Where do they come from? Is there a way to expand that pipeline? So I would ask questions about, what are we thinking in terms of the future, right? Because this is kind of, it's a weird problem because it's sort of the short term, it's what's happening right now, which is very pressing, but I can also imagine a world where what happens in 3, 4, 5 years, depending on what happens now, might also be really important for students. So I would ask some questions about preparation.
And while we were on like preparation and support, I wanted to just like pivot to Ernesto so he can give the people on the call a sense of what that can look like. So Ernesto is part of the Illinois School Leader Pipeline Program, which is a program that helps develop principals. And Ernesto, can you share with the audience like some of the hallmarks of that program? How is it helping you get ready for the principalship?
Yeah, I think there are two really huge ways that it's helped. The first thing is that I'm paired with a veteran mentor principal, and the principal in Illinois here is Jay Mullen. I mentioned he's kind of more of a um, outside of the city. He works in a more rural setting, but he is a 14-year veteran, and so that's been huge because in addition to just the experience, he's also, I would say, more free to help me engage in like management puzzles and conundrums and problem solving, even thinking ahead. I think that's been the biggest thing because it's been such a low stakes way for me to like talk through ideas, school initiatives, culture building, things that I'm really thinking about as an aspiring principal. And he, helps me pressure test those and will also give lots of feedback like, well, here's what I have experienced. Here's how I would do it. Have you thought about this? And that has been super helpful in getting me to see around corners or think about big leadership puzzles in a new way. And I felt like now when I sit at the leadership table, I have increased perspective, especially when making decisions at my school in this role. And so the experience is huge. And then the second thing that I had no idea existed before getting to this pipeline program was the Illinois Principal Association's just like access to resources. They have really cool professional help resources like prepping a resume, hosting events where you talk with other panelists of experienced principals or school administrators. But in addition to that, they provide things like an assistant principal's playbook or a principal's playbook that helps me like understand the year or what I should be thinking about as a new leader throughout like the course of a map. And so things that I didn't have perspective on before, I now have, I think it's aptly called a playbook. I hope I'm getting that right because now I have a reference to go back to and think, what should I be thinking about in August and September? How do I organize my time over the summer? What's most pressing during assessment season in the spring? And so that's been super, super helpful.
Has access to funding played a role? Like when we talk about diversity, sometimes like financial barriers come up.
Yeah, that's been, I would, selfishly for sure, that's, access to the master's program that'll get me the certification for principalship and school leader is huge. They provided me with $7,200 a year to get that, to pay for that degree at my university, and that's been massive. I know for me and for other people in my cohort, there's someone else in my cohort who has that. Where we all have families of young and teenage kids, and that's massive. I know that bringing experience from the classroom has been an important step in my like leadership journey here in education, but that also comes with time, and when you have a family, it's really hard to invest money and time into education and the certifications that you'd need for principalship. And so the IPA for me specifically has been like life-saving, and that I don't have to worry about the cost of that education so much.
Thank you. So Ed and Constance, how do states and districts keep people like Ernesto in school buildings? And when you were looking at Pennsylvania, you found higher attrition rates for principals of color in both district and charter schools. I wonder if you can talk about the findings and the implications and what states and districts can do to keep more people of color in school buildings as school leaders.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a question that reporters should be asking their state is what investments are they making in terms of preparing principals, and particularly preparing principals of color, but also what are they doing to invest in the schools in which those individuals work, and how are they working to keep them? So mentoring, and unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of research on this, and there's way more on teachers, but we do know some things. One is, mentoring and coaching tends to help. That's true of teachers and in principals. Salary is always, as our Ernesto said, money matters, and it matters because it will attract and keep people. And that's true of every profession, including journalism, right? So money matters. Your working conditions matter a whole lot. That's probably second biggest factor outside of salary. And most of that is the behaviors of your immediate supervisor. And again, that's true of most jobs, right? Your immediate supervisor makes or breaks your working conditions. So if they're super supportive and give you what you need and give you the appropriate autonomy to make decisions, you're more likely to stay. When they don't do those things, you're probably looking for another job, even if you're making pretty good money, because you need those things to be successful as a principal.
Yeah, and I'll add to there one important resource for reporters. Many states have working condition surveys that you can look at. They're surveys basically of teachers and leaders, and you can look at them by school to look at particular trends over time. So for example, in North Carolina, it's literally called the Working Condition Survey. They give it out every couple of years, and it has questions around things like discipline, support from the community, all types of sort of the intangible things that can make a place really difficult or less difficult to work in. And so I think looking at those data over time and connecting them to certain schools would be a great place for reporters to start about thinking about principal retention.
And we actually do have a principal here, an assistant principal here, so we can ask him directly, like, what are some of the things that would get him to stay in his role?
I think several of the pieces mentioned are big. I know salary, at least here in Chicago, and it varies by area, is a big factor. Noble Network, I believe, starts their principal salary. That's where I work, at $150,000 a year, and I think that's competitive. Really, the Constance talked about this working conditions survey, and I think the conditions in a school matter most. People want to feel seen and heard, and I think in service industry, in a service related field like education, where we're here for families and students, it's oftentimes we want to center their needs and their voices, but without a really good pulse on how your staff is doing, I think that will greatly impact who stays and who doesn't. And so you want to know, we have some version of something that resembles or sounds like the working conditions survey. But if I was a reporter, I'd want to know, what are the things happening? How are staff feeling about that? And how are we balancing the needs of students and families, particularly in charter schools, particularly in high equity areas, and kind of meeting teachers and administrators where they are to keep a safe and supported school environment. I know that that's top of mind, both post-pandemic and and really trying to figure out what the function of a school is. Schools took on a lot during the pandemic and post-pandemic, and I think we need to figure out that balance moving forward.
I wanted to add one more quick piece, and it's related to one of the questions that came up. But this has always been true, but I think it's even more important recently. But the role that your immediate supervisor or superintendent, sometimes it's the same person, can buffer you from outside influences. So the politicization of many things right now, if the principal, I mean the superintendent and the school board kind of can buffer all those outside distractions, and allow the principal to do their job, that's certainly helpful. And I know in Ernesto, you know, I interned as a principal. Sometimes that can really distract you from the work that you need to do with kids and teachers. So it's important. It's an important role for the supervisors of a principal.
So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm just going to jump to this question about how politicized things have become, because Ed, you just brought it up, but that's actually a question that we had here where we were talking about diversity. You know, as classrooms become increasingly politicized, how do you think this will impact efforts to diversify the principal and educator workforce?
So I think that's a great question. And actually, I think we'll need a couple more years to really sort of answer it. But in the meantime, my colleagues and I are actually working on a study where we're looking at how teachers develop racial competency, right? Like, how do they get the ability to serve, or, you know, how do they learn how to serve diverse students? And one of the things that's come up in the interviews is that many of these new teachers really feel hamstrung by outside forces. So whether it's parents or curriculum changes, and you know, they really feel like, I guess, almost scared to approach certain issues, even if they feel like they have sort of a equity orientation, or they want to have an equity lens in their work. And it almost is not even the direct actions, it's more of a chilling effect, right? So even in this sort of, this particular set of teachers are novice teachers, so they're kind of developing themselves and they're trying to learn, and some of their learning is being hindered by what's happening sort of outside of the school. So to Dr. Fuller's point, I think that really underscores the role of the leader, but leaders themselves are also, I guess, almost under attack. And there's been some examples of that here in North Carolina, where you have, you know, these overactive school boards that are then making life very hard for superintendents and principals. But so I think this is just sort of the moment that we're living in. And it's something that a good leader is going to have to figure out how to grapple with.
Just want to remind everyone on the call that you can type your questions in the Q&A section. We'll be getting to it in a couple of minutes. At any point, you can just type your questions and we'll get to it, I think maybe in about 3 or so minutes. But before we do that, I just wanted to go back to something we talked about even at the beginning, when we talked about who's leaving, right? More experienced principals and those serving students in high need schools. And I wondered if you can talk about the impact of those departures in schools right now, when educators are trying to recoup, you know, losses from the pandemic and battling persistent issues like chronic absenteeism.
Do you want to take that first, Dr. Lindsay? Or I can, either way. Okay. And I'm sure we'll pretty much say the same thing, is that in those schools, again, and I talked about it before, so all kids need, and Ernesto talked about this, they want to be seen, they want to feel heard, they want to feel like they're accepted and part of that family at the school, right? Then kids want to go to school when they feel a part of the school. It's really important to have the same adults at that school over time to build those types of relationships and to build that school culture. And when you have people leave, it's really, really hard to maintain that culture. I was working on a study when I was at University of Texas, and we were talking to students, and the students, one of them said, and this this person, the school that they were at had a different principal every year. The algebra teacher changed every year. She said, I don't feel like anybody knows my name. Like, why do I want to go to school? Literally, none of the adults know who I am. And so that's really, I think she really captured the reason why you need principal retention and teacher retention, even outside of, you know, the direct effects on student achievement and things like that. But it's really about, are you building and maintaining relationships with children and their families in the community? Or do you have this constant turnover of teachers and principals and everybody else, and it's always fracturing, and then you have to start to rebuild it. And it's, after a while, children don't trust the adults. Like, well, you're not going to stay, so why should I listen to you? And it makes leading and teaching extraordinarily difficult in those schools when children don't think the adults care enough about them to stay more than a year.
Yeah, and I'll add there too, you know, in areas where you have the sort of chronic absenteeism and also churning of enrollment, this also makes it hard to establish that school culture. So when I was at the Urban Institute, we did a report on enrollment in DC over time, and basically found that, you know, outside of the more affluent schools, you know, it was pretty unlikely that if I entered a school with a cohort, that I would graduate with that same cohort at the same school, right? And so you can imagine there are these sort of highly unstable places. And so that's really where the district really has to take sort of a firm hand in making sure that sort of at certain schools, there's not this confluence of chronic absenteeism, teacher turnover, leader turnover, because that's destabilizing for the kids, but also for communities too. So I think, you know, one key piece of this is sort of the district's actions around how they're going to spread resources, hire people, support leaders. I think that's super important.
And a question that reporters can ask the state is, are you investing in those schools? Because we know from research that states can invest in those schools and provide stipends for people to go and stay at those schools, and it actually works. So are states doing that, or are they ignoring the problem? That's a great line of questioning for reporters.
And I would just add on to there, something that links to tenure is that when you're a new school leader or new in it, I think this is fair in any position that you take on, everything can feel like an emergency and everything is new and difficult. And so to both points made earlier, the more experience you have, the easier it is to deal with the day-to-day, and the easier it is to get out into the halls and into the classrooms to build connections with students and connect with your parents, because you feel like you have the time and space and kind of expertise to do so. Being present in the school has been one of the most challenging things from last year for me, when I didn't know what I didn't know, and then and the additional impact of being a direct manager of adults outside of students, and that might be unique to education, but when you work with students and choose that career, and then you make the leap into managing adults, everything seems a little new and different. I can speak for personally.
Absolutely. So I'm just again reminding everyone that the Q&A is now open. And we have a question from Jay Goldman, a couple of questions from Jay, actually. I'll start with the first one. Does retention differ much in leadership roles between public schools and independent or religious schools, where there's less politicking seemingly at play? Does anyone want to answer that?
I haven't looked at that data. I know for teachers, they have a much higher attrition rate in private schools than in public schools. But frankly, I haven't looked at the data for principals. Generally, and one of the reasons there, and it differs a lot between really like college prep, elite private schools and lots of, you know, the smaller religious based and those types of private schools. Those smaller ones often don't pay very much, and that's probably the primary reason they see probably higher turnover than public schools, and especially the elite more elite private schools.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that data either.
Well, Shay, we can look into that and get back to you. But he also had another question about politicization, and this one is about how big a factor it is playing in driving away dedicated education leaders, whether it's principals and superintendent, and whether there's evidence that school boards that remain publicly committed to issues of equity and inclusion, whether those make any difference in holding on to talented leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another great place for reporters to look. One of the things I'm trying to gather data on right now, but it's actually very, very hard, is to look at superintendent searches and turnover over time. I do know there's a professor at University of Tennessee, Rachel White, who has collected a really great data set on superintendents over time. But I'm not quite sure how that if she's made the connections to school board politicization. That's a hard word. School board politics yet. But I mean, you could hypothesize what direction that might go in. So I think that's a great question for reporters to ask.
By the way, superintendent turnover tends to be even greater than principal. So it's definitely, at least in the states that I've seen data. And again, yeah, Rachel White at Tennessee, a friend of mine, she's done national work. But they have a higher turnover rate. And again, that then affects principals, and then that then affects teachers too. I've seen in Pennsylvania where the politicization has prompted some superintendents to leave earlier than they otherwise would have. So, and it's particularly disconcerting when you think about equity and culturally relevant and sustaining education efforts, and whether those school boards are going to support people who support that effort to help all kids, not just kids of color, but to help all kids learn those skills, which is super important. Yeah, it's really troubling trend to me.
Okay, so I promise I won't get you guys to say politicization anymore. But Ed and Constance, I wanted to ask you this. Ed had always said that turnover was high before the pandemic, and it required attention before the pandemic, because if teacher turnover was high as principal, there'd be blue ribbon panels. And I'm curious about why you think that isn't the case. Why isn't there this urgency when you look at the numbers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, part of it is probably that we take the fact that principals will be there for granted. I also think just in sort of the, the focus of ed reform for the past, 15, 20 years has been teachers. We haven't really focused on leaders. And so it's sort of gotten embedded in our brain that, teachers are the single most important factor in schools, while we've totally sort of ignored the impact of principals. So I think just culturally, we haven't really paid attention to the value of principals like we should have been doing. And so I think that's probably it. And, maybe principals will come more into sort of the pop culture conversation around education, but I'm not certain.
I wanted to add, one of the other issues is, oftentimes people you'll see in Facebook or whatever, hey, who was your first grade teacher? Who is your favorite teacher? And everybody can remember, but nobody asks, who's your favorite principal? And in fact, you might not remember your principal at all unless you got in trouble and had to go visit the principal, right? And so there's also that lack of connection that a lot of people have with the principal, whereas you have that daily connection with teachers and you see them as really important to your life. So I think that might play a little bit into it as well.
Throughout all three of you, you've had really great tips for reporters on the numbers to look for, data to explore, even research that they can, and researchers that they can connect with. And I'm curious about, this question. In the coverage that you've been reading, because I know you guys read reporters' education coverage, What are you seeing that reporters are getting right when they're looking at turnover and attrition? And what questions are they not asking? Like, what stories would you like to see reporters dig into that you're just not seeing out there?
I think I've actually been interviewed on principal turnover a couple of times in the last 2 months since I put out the report in Pennsylvania. Most of the time they get the overall rates correct. They discuss a little bit, correctly about why principal turnover matters. Personally, I think one area where they could go deeper, it's not necessarily that they're saying anything wrong, but the types of schools that Dr. Lindsay and I are talking about and Ernesto knows about, where you have lots of turnover, you have lots of student mobility, it's really difficult. A focus on those schools and what districts and states are doing to address the needs of those schools in regard to principal stability, along with teacher stability. Like we need educators to stay at those schools year after year after year, and we know they don't. What's being done about it? That to me is a huge story.
Yeah, and I would add, I think we've maybe seen enough on certain types of parents. There's other kinds of parents that whose kids attend schools who might not be as affluent or as loud, but also have ideas about how they want their children to be served. And then I'll just underscore, what's happening at the district level. There's a lot of decisions that are made by both elected and unelected folks that have lots of implications for what happens in schools. So I think, some of those stories would be really interesting, I think, to see.
Ernesto, you're in schools. What are you seeing that you think we might be missing because we're just not there every day? What are we getting wrong? What ideas you have for reporters going forward?
Yeah, I I'm really the part that I think is really missing is the context of a school. And I mean that to say we know we can look at national trends and look at student learning and testing outcomes and why they're not where we want them to be, particularly for a variety of subgroups that we pay attention to. But if you're going to write about the performance of a district or the performance of a school, I think it should be set in context. And I think you should spend some time at the school and in classrooms if possible to really understand what's happening in the spaces, because I think that the more you can be in the space and understand, I think the better the story will be, whether that's about educational outcomes or equitable outcomes or just the state of schools, period, state of public schools.
The one other thing I'd add, and because when you asked Ernesto that question, I'm like, one thing that almost nobody knows, and this is not reporters or anybody else, or just reporters, but it's everybody. I think most people have no earthly idea the amount of things that principals are responsible for. So I was on one of the people on the committee that does here's what principals are responsible for, and here's how we're evaluating them. And there were more than 100 things on that list. We're supposed to prepare them to do that, and we expect every principal to do that. So sitting down with principals and asking them, what do you have to do? What are you responsible for? And how many hours you work? Because I did a national study, and then the average number of hours worked by a principal was 60, and that was before the pandemic. I'm certain that it's higher now. And people just don't understand that. It's one of the most complicated and difficult jobs in education. Absolutely. And people need to understand that, I think, and that might help, retention as well, when people understand the work lives of principals.
Yeah, and I'll add to there, the Aspen Institute has some really nice resources on rethinking the role of the principal, where they really try to sort of underscore this point that there's a instructional piece and also a management piece. And we do some of that in the Wallace report. But I think as, we're thinking about how to move forward, I think there's going to be a lot of attention paid to that point that, maybe it makes sense for there to be dual roles or, other ways to sort of divide up this very heavy workload for principals.
so great that you both mentioned like what a principal does all day. I remember at Ed Week, we asked them to fill out their calendar for just one day. And just like reading it was exhausting. I couldn't imagine what it was like to actually do it. So yeah, they do a lot. We're going to wrap up in a bit, but we did get this question from Denise Gamble, and I was wondering whether all three of you might have some time to chime in. And it was about what research is available that explores the importance of professional networks, such as like leaders of color for males and for females, and membership in professional organizations like the IPA, NASB, and NASSB.
I can't talk directly about research, but I can talk about the experience of gaining access to something like IPA, or even a professional network here at Noble. In my network, we have a diverse leaders fellowship group that is pretty prestigious experience that you can apply to get into, and that's one of their most successful leadership pipelines. And the access to the resources is one thing, and the experience is really amazing. I think it ultimately depends on what that person is going to do with it. The only reason I'm engaged with this is probably because of my mentor principal pushing me to get active in NASSP and IPA if I want to be a really effective principal. And so the mentorship aspect of this Aspiring Leaders Grant through the IPA has been life-changing.
Ed and Constance, you know of any research that has looked at the importance of membership in these like affinity groups?
Not specifically on that, although I'd strongly suggest that one of the places to start learning about principles and the factors that affect them is the report that Dr. Lindsay worked on, that was sponsored by the Wallace Foundation. That's a great overview of much of the research, including some of my research on attrition. It's a great place to start. I don't know of any specific research on the question that was asked in terms of the different organizations.
I don't either, but I know in some of Wallace's newer work where they're funding some research on equity pipelines, some of these issues might come up, but I think it's going to be a while before that work is released.
There's the other thing that might be useful is I kind of ground everything in Hattie's work on visible learning, but there's a specific book that they put out about a school leader's impact, and that's just a meta-analysis that you might glean some information from.
Well, thank you. We're getting towards the end, and I just wanted to give each of you the opportunity to share some parting words with reporters who I know are really interested in covering school leaders and writing about how they are impacting school, particularly at this moment that we're in. So any other insights that you want to share, any questions you think they should be asking? You've already shared like some resources and the names of professors they can reach out to, but I just wanted to give you another opportunity to do that.
The one thing I'd say is please do write stories about principles from different perspectives, because it's really an under-examined area, and they're so critical to the functioning of a school and situated within a community, and they often get overlooked. So, I mean, I'll beg you, please write stories about principles, because we really need them.
I'll just +1 on that. Super important.
Ernesto, are you co-signing?
I would co-sign and then reiterate, get into the schools with them and do it with them, and write the story with the context of that.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you for joining us today and for sharing your expertise with us. I really appreciate it. That's all the time that we have. Constance, Ernesto, and Ed, again, massive thank you for sharing your wisdom and insights. Thank you to everyone who joined us and the EWA members for engaging with us on this really important conversation, particularly at the time that we ran. Please complete the webinar evaluation survey. The link is in the chat. You can take a look at that. Your feedback is really important and it helps EWA improve its offerings for future content. You can also subscribe to the EWA Today newsletter, and you can be the first when you do so to hear about new events and programs. Again, thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye.